We all go through difficult periods of growth and transformation in our lives. Chronic illness is such a difficult, ongoing challenge to navigate for many of us. The more people we talk to, the more apparent it has become that there's an ongoing theme for coping with challenges of this magnitude. In this episode, we will address a practice we've not talked about before that is an inherent gift and right for every human being. It could even be considered the definition of living or being alive. We're talking about creation, art therapy.
You're listening to Anatomy for Life with Crystal and Nicole, where we discuss the anatomy behind the most popular physical and spiritual practices so you can get the most out of these modalities on your healing journey.
Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm Crystal.
And I'm Nicole.
And today, Tamara is joining us. Hello. So the first thing we like to do is a little tune-in.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go ahead and close our eyes if you're in a place that's safe to do so. If not, just join along with the breath. Exhale first. Inhale through your nose and allow your lungs to fill up completely. Let your belly relax on your exhale. We've done the work, we have arrived, and we are whole. So we're safe to clear our minds now. Let the breath come in like a wave in the ocean and go out like the waves on the sand. Knowing that all will come to you when you need it. To be present is to be free. Notice the weight of your body pressing into the surface beneath you. Take 3 more ocean breaths. One flows right into the next. When you feel complete, just signal that with a sigh on your next exhale. And then blink your eyes open. Okay, so welcome to my dear friend Tamara, who, if you're not watching this live, if you're listening on the podcast, is beautiful and has gorgeous hair and gorgeous eyes.
We're super jealous of
and
her.
gorgeous lipstick on today and gorgeous earrings, and we will address all those things in the podcast because Tamara is an artist. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How would you like to introduce yourself? What would you like us to know about you?
Oh goodness, I am a creative soul. It's just wired in my DNA, which I find ironic. I'm the youngest of 7 in a family of engineers and scientists and computer programmers. And then along comes the youngest who defines living by how much I'm creating.
They saved up all those genes and
They saved it all for me. I have 5 older brothers and 1 older sister, and so the youngest little sister is just chaotic creative energy, and it's an adventure.
Wow, I love that.
That's amazing. So this has been through your whole life.
Yes.
You've always been drawn towards this.
I've always been creating something, and I remember as a kid, the coveted fancy pants art kits of the 90s. I got one every year for Christmas, and the markers would dry out by February, but I still loved them and used every piece. And Christmas gifts were always really easy as a kid, anything art related, and I was content until the pencils ran out and the markers were dry.
Wow. Oh, I love you even more. That's so cool. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your journey, the things that, the experiences you've been able to have, the things that have affected you that kind of brought you to where you are today.
Absolutely. I had an interesting childhood that often because I experienced it, I don't always realize how traumatic it was. It's just my life. And so I truly don't recognize how challenging my childhood was until I share it with someone. And then it hits me like a wave of, oh my goodness, I experienced this. And in the last couple of years in therapy, I've learned a lot about inner child work and learning that little Tammy is still in there and she had a rough go has been really liberating and comforting to do that work and to reclaim the childhood that chronic illness and disease kind of took from me. And a lot of my fondest memories of childhood were in creating art, whether or not I was sick. And my earliest significant memory of creating was learning beadwork when I was maybe 7 or 8. And I hope your listeners I hope people will know what I'm describing, but like the pony bead lizard keychains and snakes of the 90s.
Yes.
I made so many of those. And that's where I started learning beadwork. And that art medium has stayed with me my entire life. And the meditative and not monotonous, but just that repetitive nature of beadwork it can pull me out of any pain I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing with illness or other life challenges, and it just disappears. And I'm lost in the beads, lost in the creation, and lost in the energy of making something that didn't exist before I started. And that's gotten me through everything till now.
Was that something that you just naturally went to, or was it something that you eventually thought to yourself, I need to draw upon this, or is it just a natural inclination for you to go that route?
At the time, I think back to little Tammy, and I just couldn't get enough of the joy and pleasure of creating things. And I remember going to a ceramics class with some of my siblings and painting ceramics that would then be fired. And the owner of the shop was very confused. I was 10 or 11, and we were there for 7 or 8 hours, and I didn't speak the whole time. Really, I just painted and worked and painted. And the owner of the shop was amazed that here's this 10, 11-year-old who was focused the entire time. And I look back now and I can see that was just my soul's expression of its truest form of joy. And I truly believe that the desire to create, it's a very human trait. For me personally, it just feels like it's written into my DNA.
Oh, I love that. I can just picture a little Tammy sitting there doing those things, and it's like, I can see you, you tapped into flow, and you tapped into a place of divinity and presence, and that is a place for whatever ailment, right, is going on. Not an escape, but just more of a pure experience of reality.
Yes.
Right? As opposed to the convoluted pain and worry and suffering, right, that some of us have been asked to take on in this life. And that's just so beautiful. Some of the things I wanted to address was, it's so natural, like you said, it is written in your DNA. And I'm wondering if you know a little bit about or could help us understand what's going on neurologically or in your brain when you're creating and you're in flow, and why that's so beneficial and where they use art therapy because of this.
So it's something I'm still learning about, the neurological and psychological elements of art and creation as for self-care and emotional and mental growth. So I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. For me, a more recent diagnosis I've received in my life is ADHD. And when I look back, I can see many times in my life as a child and an adult that sometimes that flow state wasn't so much flow, but hyperfocus. And I couldn't have gotten out of it even if I tried. And as an adult, recognizing that I have, in therapy and just through my own personal work, have put in the time to learn the difference between flow state and hyperfocus, which can be more destructive, where I can paint or bead or draw for 8 to 10 hours and not move or eat or drink anything. And that's not helpful. And with lifelong chronic illness, that can be detrimental for my health. And so learning through practices like meditation and practicing daily gratitude and journaling, I've been able to identify more what it feels like in my heart and in my mind when it's a flow state. And it's this really pure form of creation where I can step out of it just as easily as you come into it. And it is not detrimental to other aspects of your life, like eating breakfast and taking care of your house and your kids and that sort of thing. But it is this amazing feeling to be able to tap into that, and just the ideas are flowing, and it's like nothing can stop you. It's the greatest feeling.
Yeah, you know what I liked about what you said is it kind of made me think how, like you said, whenever you get into those states where it would just go on for hours or whatever, that could be like almost like the opposite, where you're, somebody with addiction or something like that, where that's what feels so good, so I just want to do this all day. But learning, like anything, how to have that moderation so that you can tap into when you need to, instead of it just being like, almost a crutch. I don't know if that's the right word.
Like an escape.
Yeah.
It's a huge discernment, right, between using a good tool for escapism versus intentional presence. It's a fine line. What I love most about what you said is I learned what the difference was and felt it in my body, because I would suspect that's different for everyone. And we probably couldn't see someone doing it and know.
Yes. For me, it has looked like, and if any of the listeners have experienced this, it looks like asking myself, can I step out of this, take care of myself, take care of my home, and come back? Or am I trapped? And that's the difference between a more detrimental hyper-focus, where I'm at risk of like neglecting other responsibilities, versus this true flow where I can enjoy the creative energy and the creative process, but also take care of other needs.
That's such a beautiful point. I love that so much. And I wonder if it does have to do with the neurology, because when you're in brain scans and when someone's in flow, it's a theta state, right? Not a beta state. So there's an actual level of decreased hertz or brain waves. And so if you're in high beta, that's different. And when athletes perform the best and kids are in flow state and the most creative ideas come at a brainstorm and a board session, or you're creating your best art, that frequency is going to be dropped. And it might not look a lot different on the outside, but when they do the brain scans, it's different. And both hemispheres are working together coherently in the brain scans. It's not one more than the other. The other thing that has come out in a lot of studies and is indicative of flow state is that the means is the end, right? It is the end to the means. So it's creation for the purpose of creation. So in those brain waves, there is not room for judgment or expectations or relationships with the outcome. And so it is just art for the sake of art, creation for the sake of creation. And I feel like you have something to say.
I do. And I love that things I've experienced without knowing the science behind it, and you sharing that, because that is something I've absolutely experienced. To tap back, I know I've briefly mentioned it, just a tidbit of my childhood history and where art has just been my lifeline. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, an autoimmune disease, when I was 10 years old. And didn't know a lot at the time. This was in 2000. And I was a patient at Primary Children's for 9 years, and then graduated to other doctors. And in the first year of being diagnosed, because of the perfect combination of unpleasant things in my body, I ended up with 7 compression fractures in my spine. And I was in a back brace for many months and unable to move or stand or even sit up for weeks on end. And I've been hospitalized many times in my life since then, some more life-threatening situations than others, but the effects of this autoimmune disease and my digestive system doing just the best it can does come with me. And my main lifeline for all that has been art. And I love what you said, that the process is the end goal. And one of the beautiful things about so many art mediums is that many of them you can enjoy and create anywhere. And I can create art in a hospital bed just as well as I can in my home studio. And it's something that you can take with you. I made a list. I've always been curious, and I made a list of some of the things I've explored in my life, and taking note of how many of them can be done when you don't feel well. There's so much you can do.
Are you going to share them with us?
I would love to. So before ultimately switching my education goals to elementary education, I was studying photography and art. So a lot of this I learned in university classes, and I loved it. But some art mediums I've learned and would recommend to anyone because they're so enjoyable. I've done welding, woodwork, painting, both acrylic and watercolor and mural painting, drawing and sketching, embroidery, cross stitch, sewing, talked about ceramics when I was a kid, beading, music, sculpture, printmaking, photography, digital illustration, garden design, and metalsmithing.
Holy cow, wait a second.
I'm sure there's more, but that's what I can think of.
Yes, there are, but what is so
I
cool...
don't know, I can do like one of those.
Yeah, and what is so cool is we didn't really go through our history at the beginning of how we know each other. Tamara actually moved next door to me a few years ago, and we connected on some of these mediums too, initially. And last week we had the greatest party that I don't think I told you about, where I had just brought so much material back from the border. And so my mother-in-law,
Yes, I knew that.
and Tamara came over, and we just like divided fabric and thought like and thought about ideas of what we could create. And I mostly leaned on her to be like, what can I make with this medium, and what can I do with this? And it was just so amazing and bonding. It's been one of my favorite things about Tamara. And then when we were done, her bag was so big and so heavy, we couldn't lift it. So her cute husband, who, is farm strong, who grew up on a farm, we have a little farm over there, came over, threw it over his shoulder, and they walked home. And it was just so beautiful. But we've connected on a couple mediums. You've done a class for a youth group I was leading in watercolor. And I just had to stop and say, whoa, for a minute, because I thought I knew to some extent your creative ventures, and I had no idea. Can we just circle back to welding for a second?
Yeah. I know, I was really interested.
Absolutely. So I learned welding in a university 3D design class, which was all focused on three-dimensional art. And so there was sculpture as well as carving. That one was a challenge, not my strong suit. And then woodwork and metalsmithing and welding. My father does a lot of garage work. He's an engineer, but he also loves working in the garage, woodwork and metalwork. So I got the highest marks on that welding assignment because I had my dad, who's a master welder, teach me outside of class, and that is the only creation I actually kept from that class. My skills weren't up to par, and it deteriorated over the last 15 years since I took that class. But my welding sculpture sits in my family room. I love it.
Wow.
And I've been drawing on that with my jewelry making. I've been learning metalsmithing. So rather than working with steel rods, I've been learning the skills to work with silver and gold.
Wow, okay, and so one thing I really liked that you said was, I tried this and it wasn't necessarily what even lit you up as much maybe as others, maybe that's part of it, but also like not the direction that you were drawn towards. Because as I'm sitting here listening to you talking about all these incredible things, I can't tell you the number of things you listed, but I thought, I wish I knew how to woodwork. I wish I knew how to do this or that, for different projects around my house or whatnot. And I'm always thinking, like, what's the best way to start? Because I'm not naturally I can barely draw a stick person, right? Like, my skills are not in this area. And I've always been so jealous. Like, my 10-year-old daughter, she can just sit there and draw pretty much anything, and they're incredible to me, and it blows my mind. So I always think, how can somebody maybe find one of these areas where they're like, you know what, I could see the benefit of that. Like, how could I get started in that? Do you have any ideas?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, what's the easy ones? And also, like, what you're saying is, like, how can somebody access this modality as therapy in their lives? Because everyone's going through difficult things, and even if they haven't had the history you've had, I feel like, could we give them a little gift? And should we? And how can we incorporate this more in our lives? What would that what that do for us?
Absolutely. I first, Google and the internet is amazing, and there are so many artists sharing their skills and their knowledge on places like YouTube and Instagram and Pinterest. And so if you want to learn a new medium, start on the search engines and find people who are sharing what they know. And I believe the best advice from one artist to another, which is everyone's an artist to some level, comes back to the neurology that you shared of the process is the goal. The means is the goal, not so much the end result. This is a difficult thing for me, a recovering perfectionist, is to not even worry about what it looks like when you're done. To work to care more about the process and the act of creating than you do the end result. I have many jewelry designs that I knew from the beginning they would likely be scrapped. But I had an idea to try, and there was no way to know if it would work until I actually tried it. I have stacks and stacks of paintings and drawings that will never see the light of day other than I wanted to try something new. And so to release that fear of having something perfect and having something that you could, say, monetize or even sell, but that it's just for you, taking that fear out, all of a sudden you can develop the ability to, and the confidence to just do anything. You can do anything less than perfect. But if you have that goal of the end result being perfect, then it's very difficult to start anything new.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. That resonates with me so
I'm definitely
much.
going to go back to that clip and quote it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, because I
Mini
think,
TED Talk.
yeah, it really, many TED Talk. Yeah, I think that is so spot on because okay, again, like I'm not a natural artist, and so like thinking to myself like, what would this do for me? That like, what could I get out of this? Like healing wise, or even just contributing to, I don't know, woodworking with your family. You know, I think sometimes it's just starting and saying it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, and I remember right whenever COVID was hitting hard and the shutdown, I had actually decided, okay, I'm going to take a woodworking class. Like right before that, I told my husband I was so into it because I'm so into interior design and I wanted to do all these things. And I started looking up classes, exactly what you're saying. And I started looking at classes like, I'm going to go to like the local community college or whatever. I'm going to take a woodworking class. And literally within 2 weeks of that, like all of those shut down because they were all hands-on, right? Yes. And I'd kind of forgotten about it until now. And so it's inspiring me to realize like, you know what, and maybe I won't be amazing at it, but if I love it and it helps me and it's a great tool in my arsenal, anybody could start, you know, gardening. How many times do you hear people say, like you were talking about, they say, oh, I suck at gardening, I suck at plants or whatever, right? But we can develop those skills.
Absolutely. And it's an opportunity to practice like reaching out to people and building your community of support by reaching out to strangers on the internet by watching their lessons and tutorials or friends that you know that learn things that you can start to draw on the community around you and learn from other people and to pull on those strengths. Something that keeps coming to mind that I want to share. I've referenced more than once that everyone is creative. Everyone's an artist. And I've thought of this a lot since marrying my husband. He's a chemical engineer. And I graduated in elementary education, and I'm an artist soul. So very different ways of processing and looking at the world. And he, when we were first married, would always say, I'm not creative, I'm not artistic. And over the years, we've been married for 10 years this summer, I've seen how his creative energy comes out. And it is in design and three-dimensionality, whereas a lot of mine is in more artistic mediums. And so I mentioned like garden design earlier. He grew up on a farm, and he's really good at the skills to keep the plants alive and actually get a harvest. But he relies on me to then design it, and I will even sketch out the garden and plan out the space. And so we rely on each other's creative strengths and skills to then have a beautiful garden at the end of the
I
season.
was wondering why your garden looks so good.
Conley has the farm knowledge and I have the design.
That's perfect. Oh my god. I'm sort of wondering if you'd be willing to circle back and share whatever is on your heart to share about I feel like this is really important because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are mommies. I think it's really important in children. And I want to address the thing about going to public school as early as 1st or 2nd grade and starting comparison in these creative venues, and it really being such a detriment at that age. And you didn't have that childhood. You were in hospitals, not in, elementary school. So pros and cons.
Yes.
In a sarcastic way. But I think it's lent to just, some of the beauty that shines through your soul every time I see you. And I just wonder what you have surrounding your thoughts on children and therapy and art therapy and any personal experiences you felt called to share.
Absolutely. The way you put that and how I see it manifesting in my life now is I'm pretty scrappy. In that sometimes you just sink into the hard things, the sadness, the emotions of it, and that's not a bad thing. I've also been able to develop the ability to just find opportunity, no matter how difficult. And as a child, I relied on this positive energy, especially when my physical body was too unwell to even move. And one of the beautiful things about places like Primary Children's is they understand children. And the times when I was hospitalized, they have craft rooms and art rooms, and people would come in and bring supplies or bring little lessons. So even when I was hospitalized and not at home, I was able to create things with what little energy I had. And then I could go back to my hospital room and rest, and my mom would read to me. So when I was physically too unwell to do anything myself, my mother would take me to anywhere but the hospital through stories and art. And I saw that from her as well. My mother was a phenomenal embroiderer, counted cross stitch. Her pieces are phenomenal. And she would cross stitch in the hospital room while I slept and while I watched movies. And so I watched her in this really unpleasant space, taking care of her youngest child be very unwell. And she still found moments to share her love of reading, but to also create for herself. And I would take sketchbooks everywhere as a kid, and I had colored pencils. And now as I've grown up, even in doctor's waiting room, I have an iPad with drawing programs on it. And so I can either work on designing bead projects, embroidery projects, or I can enjoy digital illustration and take it with me. And there's a lot of ways you can be scrappy and find opportunities to create and to find those little pockets where you need a boost from creating something that it starts in your mind and then it's in reality. And when you're sitting in doctor's rooms or you're going through a difficult time, or I'm not a parent, but if you're raising kids and it's crazy, to find those moments to create something yourself or with your children, you're making something out of nothing and it's magical.
Yeah, and you know what I love about that too is how many times do we as moms or just anybody who is living in this world with this crazy busy, our fast pace, especially in the United States, right? And do we make excuses and say, I can't even fit in the time to do this. And you've shown us that you can find different ways to do it, whether it's if you're sitting at a doctor's office when you'd probably just be sitting there scrolling on your phone or doing something else. That I firmly believe we make time for what's important for us, right?
And that's like a self-care category, right? Is that correlating? Because if
Absolutely.
you can look at creation and art as your self-care category.
Absolutely. And when things around you are chaotic, and sometimes really challenging things happen to us and they're truly out of our control. I was able to spend this past summer with my sister and her children as she's been going through nursing school. And children are very naturally, inherently creative beings, and that disappears or it shifts and evolves with kids. And for some, unfortunately, it disappears and that creative energy is a little dried up. And if we're able to create and build a community around us, when we are overwhelmed and we truly don't have time, then we can rely on other people. And a lot of my time spent with my nieces and nephews was in art projects and doing creative things and spending time together while my sister studied. And then when she had study breaks, we'd have dance breaks and we'd share what we created, and she was able to enjoy that with us. And I've had other opportunities with friends with young children where they just needed a break. And so Aunt Tammy would come and do craft projects with their kids, and Mom would get a break, and I would get to create with their kids. And reaching out to friends, even if doesn't have to necessarily be like a professional artist friend, but just reaching out to your community and saying, my kids really want to do an art project. And I'm sure everyone knows at least one person in their life that will come and brave the glitter disaster that comes with any child's craft project.
I was gonna say, are you for hire? Is that something you're offering? Call Tammy and she will bring you a glitter bomb project.
Well, what I love about
You have to do the cleanup after.
the worst part. What I love also about what you're saying is it's that service side to it that like is so healing for all of us when we get enveloped in it. So like it's so reciprocal, right? Because you're getting something out of it as well. And we were talking a little bit before this podcast, a little bit about imposter syndrome, when in reality, like we just have like whatever, even if it was 10% more knowledge than what somebody else has, we can share that with them and what they glean from it. And then what we also get healing wise from service, I think is,
Absolutely.
I mean, you can't even.
And that might relieve all of your expectations and perfectionist, things that you're putting in your outcomes if you're sharing it.
Well, and if you are willing to stretch yourself and put yourself in an opportunity to create with children, creative energy is pure and beautiful. Creative energy that exists in a room of children making things. Not many children are concerned with what the outcome of their drawing will be. They're just drawing. And I love seeing kids, preschool and kindergarten age, learning and developing the fine motor skills. And objectively speaking, what they create may not be worthy of a museum, but the pride and the joy in their face, that fear of not being good at something to try woodworking or welding, it holds us back. And then you watch kindergartners create the most chaotic of a scribble drawing ever, and they'll treasure it all through kindergarten. And there's a lot we can learn.
They just love the process and enjoying, and that's
Absolutely.
something I think he said, as adults a lot of times we have by that point moved away from whatever the creative process is, because maybe as a child we said, oh, she's an incredible artist, and like I said, I can barely draw a stick person, so I'm not even going to continue down that creative path because I'm not as good as she is, like that.
Yeah, and what I want to say is that is Shakti energy. So that's the divine feminine.
Yeah.
And we could all, no matter what your gender identifications are, call in more. We could all use more of the divine feminine creative energy in balancing our things. I don't know if you feel that way. It sounds like you're completely made up of that energy, but we can borrow some of it. Since you're not for hire for that, I want you to tell us what your main thing you're into now, where we can follow you on Instagram and stuff and see some of your current art.
Absolutely. A lot of my art I haven't been sharing publicly for two reasons. One, I've been leaning into just whatever my heart wants to create. My health is always taking turns, and recently it's been a challenge. I also kind of inadvertently took last year off after my mother passed. I needed more time than I anticipated, and so there's not a lot to see at the moment, but that energy is definitely flowing again. My main medium of choice right now is my beadwork and watercolor. I don't share my watercolor painting publicly right now. It's just for me to tap into that flow and just enjoy the process just for me. And I have really enjoyed that, especially with personal life challenges, just having something that intentionally I don't share, except for when Crystal asks me to share it with youth groups. And I love sharing that, because when life is challenging, watercolor, you can learn a lot from that.
Yeah,
it
you've
flows.
gifted us. That's service.
just
You
flows.
gifted us that exact gift and some skills and some,
And I love it. It's very meditative, and sometimes it's just when you're overwhelmed to just paint watercolor and tip the paper in it flow and try and accept that energy can be really healing. But my main medium of choice right now is definitely my beadwork. And you can find me on Instagram at Rose of Beads, spelled R-O-S-E, like the flower. My business name I named after my bridal bouquet, which is Beaded Roses, that I did. I worked on it. I started my bouquet in high school.
Do you have that picture on your Instagram? Because it's incredible.
I do have it on my Instagram, yes. If you scroll back to the beginning, it's one of the first photos I shared because that's where the inspiration for my name. Kind of a pun, play on words, rows and rows and rows of beads. Lots and lots of beads, but also my bouquet was a rose made of beads. So it's a little tricky to find. R-O-S-E of beads.
We'll link it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
For sure. But I love that, and I just am wondering if there's any takeaway message or any things you want to share about the whole journey and the tools you found to carry you through these things before we end.
I do, and I took some notes because it's been just repeated a lot. Can I start that over?
Yes.
I appreciate that after 23 years of being chronically ill and having things fluctuate, my art practices and self-care has evolved as much as I have. And I've learned a lot in this time, both from periods when my health was really poor versus when it was doing really well and I was able to physically do more than other times. And a conclusion I've come to many times that I feel like we could all remember, not just when our health is challenging or life is challenging, is that life isn't so much about what happens to us, but what we do with it. And not in the sense that the challenging or bad things that happen to us have a silver lining. Some things don't. Sometimes life is just challenging, but what we can do with it is keep going. And healing is not always linear. And with chronic illness, in my case, true healing will likely never come. And that makes it exhausting and tiring. So finding those pockets to tap into the purest energy that we can gets us through the realization that life is always challenging and chronic illness is challenging. And for me, that's been creating. And if we're willing to accept where we're at and to accept opportunity and look for it when it comes, even if it's just buying a tiny little sketchbook to keep in our purse and a pencil so that we can draw while we're waiting in a grocery line or at the doctor's office, or to finally start a garden, or to take that class and learn woodworking, or to learn a new skill, and to choose to look at it as the process is the most important part. The energy that comes from simply creating something that didn't exist before, that's healing from the inside out. And that's what gets us through even when life is challenging.
Wow, so beautifully said. And with that beautiful message, thank you for being with us today. And thank you for sharing your light and your wisdom and your art. And
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
I think this is definitely probably fill a lot of people up and give a lot of people a lot of wonderful ideas, new things that maybe they hadn't even thought of, or things they were scared to even try.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I have a lot of really crummy artwork in my studio closet, and I'm proud of every single piece.
I love it. And don't forget to check out our show notes and follow